we had seen the events of 1933. 1934 was started with a sensational event. That was the non-aggression pact between Hitler, Germany and Poland. And because this was a total change in the attitude of the two countries. And we had examined why Hitler wanted it and did it, and why the Poles did it. We also examined what the other allies, the countries which had been close to those, how they did take this change. The French were shocked that their ally Poland was now dealing with Hitler, their potential enemy. And we had seen that one French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bartout, tried to revive the alliance with Russia, which would have been a new edition of the Franco-Russian alliance of pre-World War I. We had also seen that that this ultimately failed because the minister, the main architect of this, was assassinated, was killed during the assassination of the Yugoslav king to France. Stalin also felt upset about this because he had already a potential enemy in the Far East, the Japanese. The Poles were never his friends. Now the Germans became now an additional enemy in the West. And so he then, facing the same kind of delicate position as the Poles and the Germans themselves, having two enemies on each side, wanted now to revive the Western alliance. And in order to do this, he gave out a new directive, a new order to the communist parties worldwide through Comintern. He gave out the order that they should try by all means to set up a popular front with the democratic parties, with the liberals and socialists, in order to prevent a fascist takeover in other European countries, more particularly in France and in Spain. And we will see that this will have far-reaching consequences for Spain in particular, a little bit later. That was not all. Stalin also appointed as Minister of Foreign Affairs a man who had a Jewish background and who was supposed to work towards a rapprochement with France. And the Jewish background was not an accident, because it had, in this regard, very clearly an anti-Nazi bias, because everybody knew that Hitler did not like the Jews, and appointing a Jew now at the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Soviet Union, this meant that he wanted to have a counterweight to Hitler. Now, who of you in her or his reading did come across the name of this man who became Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1934 until 1939? His first name is Maxim Litvinov. Litvinov, capital L-I-T-V-I-N-O-V. Litvinov. Litvinov was Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Litvinov will try for the 5 years between 1934 and 1939 very hard to set up an alliance with Great Britain and with France. But without success, we can say this right away. But this was Stalin's turnaround as a response to this non-aggression pact between Germany and Poland. Now, the second event, which did take place in terms of foreign policy in 1934, was Hitler's meeting with Mussolini. We know that Hitler, from the early 20s on, when he was still a nobody, a drummer, an anonymous drummer, the man from the gutter, he admired Mussolini. Mussolini was his great model, his great example. So he wanted to get to know Mussolini. Unfortunately for him, at least in 1934, Mussolini did not share this high appreciation of Hitler. On the contrary, Mussolini had originally at least an anti-German bias. And he had lots of contempt for Hitler. So in other words, he was not warm at all. So they met in Venice in 1934. And this meeting did not bring the two of them closer to one another. Hitler, in total disregard of his, let's say, his host's attitude, Hitler was trying to speak at him for hours, and Mussolini was so annoyed when he had to listen to this endless speech of Hitler that instead of giving him as long an answer, he would just say, okay, let's go and have tea now. So in other words, the meeting passed without a rapprochement. On the contrary, it was very cold. So in that regard, it was a failure. It did not bring the two dictators closer, and this was particularly a failure resented by Hitler. Then comes one event which has a peculiar meaning. In July 1934, the Austrian Nazis tried to seize power in Vienna. And during this violent attempt to seize power, they assassinated the Austrian Chancellor. Now, the Austrian Chancellor, that is the head of the Austrian government, the man's name was Dollfuss. Dollfuss, you spell it capital D-O-L-F-U-S-S, Dollfuss. Now, what was the significance of this attempt? First of all, you must imagine that this assassination, this violent attempt to seize power in Vienna did occur 3 weeks only after Hitler had ordered the Night of the Long Knives. In other words, 3 weeks after there had been this bloodbath in Germany, when Hitler ordered the killing of the SA leadership plus his avowed or past internal political enemies. Now, 3 weeks later, this new violent action in Vienna. And this, Mussolini considered this as a provocation for him, Mussolini, for different reasons. First of all, Dollfuss, Chancellor in Austria, was an ally, if not to say a satellite or a junior partner of Mussolini. The Italians considered Austria at that time as their chasse gardée, as their, let's say, satellite or their favorite partner. And they considered now the attempt to seize power as a hostile attempt directed also against them. What made it even worse was that on the one side, Dollfuss' family spent, because this was in the last part of July, Dollfuss' family spent their holidays with Mussolini's family on the Adriatic. In other words, they were even personally, family-wise, very close to one another when Dollfuss was assassinated. And in addition, Hitler had not said a word about, had not made a hint about anything like this when the two dictators had met a month earlier or 6 weeks earlier. So there was, in the eyes of the outside world, there was no doubt that Hitler either ordered this attempt to take place or he gave the green light to the Austrian Nazis, because it was unlikely that the Austrian Nazis would have dared to seize power without getting Hitler's go-ahead, without being approved by Hitler. And because it failed, and Mussolini reacted violently. Mussolini sent 5 Italian divisions, army divisions, to the Brenner Pass, that is to the frontier between Italy and Austria. And this was now a clear sign to the Germans, if they would dare to go further in trying to take over Austria, that the Italians would militarily block them. So in other words, this assassination of Dollfuss by the Austrian Nazis was a setback. It was a failure. Hitler appeared now, after this assassination of the SS, the settling of accounts with his internal former partners, the whole hideous face of National Socialism appeared all of a sudden, clearly, before world public opinion. And so whatever he might have won a year earlier by signing a treaty with the Vatican was now practically lost. So in other words, this was not now something positive for his image. But it did not prevent him a few days later, August 1st, to take over Hindenburg's succession. In other words, this did not prevent him from consolidating his internal grip, his absolute personal control over everybody in Germany. And at the same time, it did not trigger off a European political or military reaction against what he was doing. So in other words, he was not threatened as a consequence of this assassination in Vienna by his neighbors, neither the French nor the Poles. The Italians had sent the army division of the Brenner Pass, but that was not, the Brenner Pass was not a frontier with Germany, it was a frontier with Austria. Yes, John?
Did you say that he took over Hindenburg's position in August?
August 1st, yes. We had, remember when we spoke about the consolidation of Hitler's dictatorships, he became president. A name and a title he did not assume, he transformed it in that in Führer. So in other words, the year 1934 ended, maybe not as glorious as he might have expected, but he had every reason to be satisfied. Because on the one hand, there was a non-aggression pact with Poland. The Poles did stick to it. It would have been hard to imagine what the Poles might have done if this non-aggression pact had not existed when the assassination in Vienna occurred. And on the other hand, Hitler now had to go one step further, because at the end of 1934, the Germans could not continue to hide what they were secretly doing, that is their massive rearmament to prepare for World War II. So in other words, he had now to go one step further, and therefore with 1934 ends the time period of secret rearmament and of consolidation of power in Germany. We get now to the second stage, that is from 1935 till 1937, which is the open violation of key articles of the Versailles Peace Treaty, particularly related to disarmament, and also already keener actions in foreign policy, but not yet territorial violations of their neighbors' political or territorial integrity. So we get to the time period 1935-1937. And as we have done it for the first stage, we will examine now the events of each year, 1935 first. Now, in this regard, Hitler proved that in terms of political or diplomatic psychology, he was a master. He did not only know how to speak to the masses, he also knew how to handle his neighbors in Europe, particularly in the first instance. On March 9th, 1935, Goering announced publicly that Germany had an air force. In other words, he proclaimed that Germany had a Luftwaffe, an air force. Now, what was so special about this proclamation? First of all, what was new was Goering did not say we are going to build up an air force, but he said we have an air force. So in other words, he practically admitted that they had already violated the Versailles peace treaty military clauses even before. This was admitting that they had already done this the 2 years before. They had an air force. And this was against the Versailles peace treaty. Now, which were the circumstances, how Hitler did? Why did Hitler not himself say this? First of all, he could, if a violent military or political reaction would come, he could disavow Goering. He could practically say, what did this stupid Goering say now? I deny this, because in terms of lying, we know that for him the truth and the lie, that was practically the same. So in other words, he sent his second in command out first to test how the West, how the French and the British, or Mussolini, how they would react to it. And there was one more clever thing. Goering announced this on a Friday afternoon. Now, what was so peculiar about Friday afternoons? Because simply Hitler knew that in London, but particularly in Paris, the Council of Ministers was dismissed. In other words, that those who might react it were out for their holidays. In other words, for the weekend. Nothing would happen because they were not prepared to this. And they would not immediately call in an emergency session, or at least not decide emergency measures. And so the consequence was the reaction to this proclamation of possessing already an air force, the reaction on the part of other European countries, they protested. They protested politically against this violation without any other consequences. So in other words, without any serious action. And when Hitler noticed this, then a week later, that is on March the 16th, he came forward and he proclaimed now that Germany was introducing the compulsory military service, and that Germany would build up its army to a level of 30 divisions, approximately 500,000 soldiers. Now, this, of course, was a much further reaching violation of the Versailles Peace Treaty, because according to the Versailles Peace Treaty, the Germans were supposed to have only an army of 100,000, not 500,000. So in other words, this was a much graver violation. And this did upset now the other European countries. Hitler, of course, gave as an excuse. He said, we are waiting now already for 16 years for the disarmament of all the other European countries, of the French, of the British, and whom else. They don't. In other words, if they did not disarm, then we consider we have the right to have a normal army. And so he introduced this compulsory military service and put up the amount of soldiers to about 500,000. The reaction this time was not now of simple protest. Yes?
What was the domestic reaction to instituting a draft?
What was the
domestic reaction to...
They, of course, applauded to this. First of all, they had... The German people by that time was under a double grip. First, the propaganda. Goebbels and Hitler presented this, that they were ultimately joining the ranks of great powers of having now a normal army. And so the Germans felt proud that they had now an army like anybody else. And secondly, in other words, they expected sooner or later that they would have this army. And of course, the German generals, they applauded. They had now their toys. And in addition, any kind of opposition, but there was no opposition, would have met the Gestapo, the SS, which were under the command of Himmler, and which, with their repressive means, with concentration camps spreading out over Germany, that they would have made short shrift with anybody.
So were they happy also because it gave people jobs? Was the employment rate still low? Or?
This meant also that 500,000 young people would be off the street, because they were now in the ranks of the German army, yes. But the reaction now of the other European countries was at least looked at first sight a more serious reaction. The French, the British and Mussolini, particularly in the light of what had happened a year earlier, that the Germans, that the Austrian Nazis had tried to seize power in Vienna. Now that Hitler was introducing the compulsory military service, that is, that he gave himself the means of having an army, this was a threat to the European security, to the peace, and to the status quo in terms of territory. And so they met, the French and the British met Mussolini in a resort place in northern Italy, on the island, I think it is the Lago Maggiore. There is an island which is called Stresa. Stresa, capital S-T-R-E-S-A, Stresa. And in this meeting, the two democracies met with the fascist dictator to set up a common front against Hitler. So they made two decisions, which were in fact nothing else but declarations. They committed themselves without a formal treaty, without a formal alliance, neither military nor political. They committed themselves to preserve the boundaries of the European countries as they had been fixed after World War I. In other words, they committed themselves to prevent any change of boundaries of territories as it had been established after World War I, and they specifically guaranteed the territorial integrity of Austria, because this was simply in memory of what the Nazis had tried the year before. They committed themselves to guarantee the territorial integrity of Austria. But there was no formal alliance, there was no formal treaty which would have implicated very precise commitments in terms of taking military or political action. Now, this agreement, if we call it an agreement, was called the Stresa Front. It meant that it was, of course, a hostile move to Hitler, because as Hitler introduced the compulsory military service, it could be expected that he would try to violate the frontiers as they were established after World War I. Soon afterwards, the Stresa Front did take place in April. 2 months later, in June, the world got to know, as a big surprise, that Germany and England had signed a naval agreement. So Hitler signed a naval agreement with England, and in this naval agreement, he was allowed, the British would allow him to expand his navy to 35% of the strength of the British Navy. And what was also important was he was allowed to build submarines, and to build heavy warships, which was against the Treaty of Versailles. But of course there was a limit, there was a top limit on how far he could go in terms of naval arrangement. So this naval agreement meant that after the Air Force, after the Army, it was now also on the level of the Navy, that Hitler was practically assuming again full sovereignty and full power, even though there was this kind of a limit.
Was this Lloyd George, and why would he agree to this? Or was this still Lloyd George?
No. Lloyd George, excuse me, I might have mentioned that. Lloyd George was over. He was forced to resign after Rapallo. After Rapallo, that is after 1922, that was Lloyd George's last attempt to bring the British back on the international level to restore international trade. When this conference, which originally was held in January 1922 in Genoa, when this failed, Lloyd George was forced to resign. And so he disappeared from the picture. And in those days in England, nominally, the Labour was in power, but in reality there was a coalition government where the Conservatives were moving up, and those who were very influential among the Conservatives were Austin Chamberlain, who had nothing to do with, well, he was a half-brother of Neville Chamberlain, and Baldwin also played a role. Neville Chamberlain was head of the Exchequer, so the Conservatives were important in England. But your question is not a very valid one, because the question is, this was even worse than Hitler's first moves, because first he violated the clause of the Versailles Peace Treaty, but that was not all. In addition, this violation was practically approved by the British, who signed this agreement with him. Yes?
Is there a name for that agreement?
It's a naval agreement. It's called Naval Agreement of June 1935 between England and Germany. So it was first a violation of the Versailles Peace Treaty, and secondly, it was also a blow to the Stresa Front. Because in what sense was the blow to the Stresa Front? The British had sat together with Mussolini and with the French to oppose Hitler. Now they signed an agreement where they practically approved Hitler's violation of a military clause of the Versailles Peace Treaty.
I guess my question is, how are they benefiting from this treaty?
Okay, why did they sign it?
Yeah.
That's the question. The question was, they signed it because Hitler blackmailed them. Hitler told the British, I offer you to sign this agreement with me. If you do, then we will limit our naval rearmament to 35%. If you don't, then there will be no limitations on our naval rearmament. Of course, he was bluffing. He did not have the intention to build up a powerful navy. But of course, the British, they remember what had happened to them in the 10 years preceding 1914, when they had entered a real naval race with the German Navy before World War I. I open a parenthesis here. Because, you know, before World War I, the Emperor, William II, who was not as wise as Bismarck and who challenged the British when he gave in to one of his advisors, an admiral who wanted to have a big navy. So the Germans started then building big battleships from 1900 on. And the British had one rule in their, let's say, naval policy. They always wanted a navy twice as strong as the strongest European navy. So when the Germans built one battleship, the British had to build twice, to build two of them, dreadnoughts. So in other words, the British were forced to enter a naval race which cost them a lot of money. And now, in memory of this, they wanted to avoid such a naval race with Hitler. And so when Hitler said, either you sign this, or we will feel free that we will have no limit to our naval rearmament. Now, of course, the British could not, because they were not ready to take military action against Hitler in 1935, so they gave in. But of course, the effect of this was disastrous. The French were furious. The French did not expect that the British would leave them in the lurch, facing the Germans in such a way. Mussolini felt that for the British, the Stresa front was not worth very much. And so Hitler, of course, was extremely pleased. He got away with this. The French protested, but this was, of course, of no practical avail. So there was every reason that Hitler had to be satisfied, because now, between March and June 1935, he practically resumed full latitude in terms of rearmament. That was not all of that year. In October 1935, Mussolini, all of a sudden, it looked like it, but it really was not all of a sudden, Mussolini started a colonial war in Africa. Italy started invading Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia, that is the name which the country has today. You know, it's a country which is located in Eastern Africa. It's not far away from the Sudan, and it lies between two Italian colonies. Italy had two colonies on both sides of Ethiopia. The old name under which it was known was Abyssinia. Abyssinia and Ethiopia, it's the same. I suppose that you are familiar with the name of Ethiopia. Now, the two Italian colonies which are on both sides of Ethiopia, one is Somalia, that is on the southern eastern side. Somalia, that's a place where the pirates, you know, on the Red Sea, where they start raiding the civilian ships which pass by. Somalia was an Italian colony. The Italians lost it after World War II. And the other one is Eritrea. Eritrea is another Italian colony which lays on the other side of Ethiopia. Yes?
Can you spell that?
Yes. E-R-E-T-R-Y-A. Eritrea. Now, why did Mussolini do this? Why did he attack Ethiopia? Well, you could say that to some degree, and this is a notion which Hitler did not cultivate on his own, that is living space. Mussolini pretended that the Italian people were, on a too narrow territory in Italy. Italy was not big enough for the Italian population which was growing. It needed living space. And Mussolini found that Ethiopia was, among most African countries, a place which could be considered as favorable for Italian colonies, for Italian settlers. Because even though it is not that far away from the equator, that is, it's located in an area where it is usually very warm and not that easy for Europeans to live, but it is very mountainous, it is hilly. In other words, it does not suffer from this kind of strong heat which other countries in its neighborhoods are exposed to. And for Mussolini, it was, of course, more of an excuse. The two other reasons why Mussolini did this have to do, one with the national pride, the other one with a diversion for his domestic shortcomings, which he was exposed to in 1935. First, national pride. National pride had to do with a defeat. The Italian army had suffered 40 years earlier when they had made a first attempt around 1898 to invade and conquer Ethiopia. This had failed. The Italian army had been defeated by the Ethiopians. Now, of course, the Ethiopians, they had a relatively primitive equipment, but they had also modern weapons. And the modern weapons they used against the Italians, and they knew the terrain much better, were weapons which they had been given by the British. The British were in control of Egypt, they were in control of the Sudan, and also of other strategic places, and the British looked very unfavorably to this Italian expansion. So the Italian army was defeated, and this was considered as a great humiliation, that a European army being defeated by a non-European country. The other defeat, which had similar kind of consequences, was when the Russian army was defeated in the war with Japan in 1904-1905 by the Japanese. But to come back to this issue of the Italians, Mussolini wanted to take revenge for this defeat of Adua. The name of the battle where they lost is not important. So that was as a matter of restoring national pride. The second thing was more important, because Italy was also suffering from the economic crisis. And Mussolini, in order to keep in power, he practically intensified repression. In other words, he made the repressive arm of the fascist state even firmer. In other words, to some degree, repression against political opposition. The Italian population was unhappy about food restrictions and so on. And on the other hand, nonetheless, he tried to divert the dissatisfaction of his Italians towards a foreign policy stage. And therefore, he started this war. Which were now the consequences of this? The war, by the way, with the Italian army used modern equipment, that is, air force, even gas, tanks, artillery, and nonetheless it took them 8 months from October 1935 until May 1936 to conquer the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. In other words, it was not now a war over in a couple of days or a couple of weeks. It lasted nonetheless, because the Ethiopians resisted. Ethiopia was at that time a member of the League of Nations. And so in that sense, this was an aggression. This was an open aggression of an independent country. Ethiopia, by the way, was the last remaining independent African country. And so Mussolini was then condemned by world public opinion and was also condemned by the League of Nations as an aggressor. Now, he resented these condemnations, particularly on the part of the British and the French, because at the time of the Stresa Front in April 1935, he was already preparing the invasion. We'll stop here. You have suffered enough for today.